We've all seen that technician who left his cable laying on the grid, or worse yet, attached his wires to the ceiling grid wire. Is that right, or is it wrong? Well, the answer is a little bit more complicated than you think, so join us on today's episode as we cover this subject.
Don't hang up that phone. We've found what you're looking for. Welcome to the 5 Minutes with RCDD podcast. Well, seeing how we're pulling Category 6A, the most powerful twisted pair in the world, you gotta ask yourself this one question. Did I pull 295 or 300 feet? Well, do you feel lucky? Do you, punk? In this podcast, you'll learn the differences between a 66 and 110 punch tool, the proper way to install a support cable, along with terminating and testing parameters. What exactly does RCDD stand for? Really can't do diddly? Or just some guy that's just sitting around in a chair making podcasts. So join us as we talk about the ever-changing world of telecommunications, from ISP to OSP, from copper to fiber, design to installation. Now send the new guy to the truck for a bucket of dial tone and the cable stretchers, while you listen to an informative program on telecommunications. Here's your host, Chuck Bowser, RCDD.
Welcome to the show where we tackle the tough ICT questions posed to us by installers, technicians, project managers, estimators, engineers, communications people, IT people, where our goal at the end of the day is to connect at the human level so we can connect the world. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button, hit the bell button for notification. If you're listening to this on the podcast platforms, make sure that you go and rate it for us so we can beat that algorithm, so we can help get this message out to other people. Now let's get on with the show. It is our duty to provide our own independent support for the cable that we install inside of the ceilings, right? You cannot use other trades to support your work. That means you can't use the ceiling grid or the ceiling grid wire. There are three things that happen when you don't. Number one, you affect the safety on the project. And I'll get into the detail in a little bit to explain what that means. We're also going to affect the performance, and it's going to make you look unprofessional. Who wants to look unprofessional? The idea for today's show came up with a conversation in a Slack channel with low voltage installers. And once we got done having the conversation, I realized, based on that conversation and questions that I've gotten in the past, that I really need to do a show about this. And I apologize for this show being a day late because it should have came out yesterday on Monday. But Monday, when I got set up and got ready to start doing recording, one of my female goats had other plans. She decided to have birth of her triplets. And by the time we got done dealing with that, coming back in the house, it was too late to set up and record. If you want to see some baby goat videos, some cute baby goat videos, make sure you check out our YouTube channel, The Bowser Journal. Now, before we dive into the electrical code book and what it actually says, we have to cover some foundational stuff, right? Number one, interpretation. The only interpretation that really matters is the AHJ, the authority having jurisdiction, also known as the electrical inspector. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what your boss or whoever trained you thinks. The only person whose opinion really matters when it comes to interpreting the code book is the authority having jurisdiction. And number two, just because you've never failed a project because you've used ceiling grid wire or lay your cable on the grid doesn't mean it was right. There are good electrical inspectors and there are bad electrical inspectors. You just consider yourself lucky because it was about 15 years in my career before I got nailed by my first inspector for not supporting my cables correctly. So I often hear, Chuck, why can't I just attach my cables to the ceiling grid wire? It's only just a few cables. Well, the ceiling grid is a listed product. Remember a few episodes back when we talked about the code book, we covered the terms listed, labeled, and approved. If you don't know what those are, go back to that episode and make sure that you watch it. So in essence, listed basically means that that assembly was tested to meet safety standards and is on a list that's approved by the authority having jurisdiction to install in their area. When they test those ceiling grid systems, they don't test them with a whole bunch of 4-pair cable or 25-pair cable or fiber optic cable laying on the grid. It's not tested with that kind of weight. As soon as you start putting those kinds of weight on that system, it is no longer a listed system. It's not the way it was designed or certified. When you lay your cables on the grid, there are some safety issues that you're going to have to worry about. Number one, you're not going to be able to get up in the ceiling to do your work. You might not be able to lift up the tiles. You might break tiles, so those tiles might come down and fall on somebody or get in somebody's eye. Number two, the electrical inspector is not going to be able to get up in that ceiling. He's not going to be able to inspect your work. And more importantly, the fire department, the firefighters, after they put out the building fire, the next thing they do is called checking for extension. They want to get up into the ceiling to make sure that the fire didn't leap into the cavity of the ceiling and is continuing in that cavity of the ceiling. And that ceiling structure has been weakened through the heat of the fire. So now they're poking and prodding at a grid and wire system that's been weakened from the heat of the fire. It could collapse, fall, and injure a firefighter. Trust me, you don't want to be in court because you injured a firefighter. And then lastly, performance, right? So performance, you're going to be laying your cables. If you're laying your cables on the grid, they're going to be near potential sources of EMI. EMI is electromagnetic interference. I'll do an episode in the very near future explaining EMI, what it is, and actually how to take care of that. Some sources of potential EMI in a ceiling include fluorescent light ballasts, ceiling speakers, and other things like that. And then the problem with EMI is it's very difficult to diagnose. It's easy to fix, but you have to be able to diagnose it first. And it's kind of hard to really figure that out sometimes, especially for novice people who don't know how to use the cable certifiers yet. And then thirdly, putting the cable on the grid or attaching to a ceiling grid wire makes you look unprofessional. Be a step above everybody else. Don't do it like somebody else is doing. Just because they did it doesn't mean it's the right way. Support the cable with your own independent wire. So now let's take a look at what the 2020 code book actually says about ceilings and low voltage cabling. Now I'm going to read verbatim from the code book, and then I'm going to come back and expand on the areas where I've had electrical inspectors, or AHJs, interpret it and how they interpret it. So here we go. Section 300.11, paragraph A, titled Secured in Place. It says, raceways, cable assemblies, boxes, cabinets, and fittings shall be securely fastened in place. Bam, right there. It tells you it's got to be secured. But it doesn't tell you it has to be secured by a J-hook or by a ceiling grid wire. It just says it has to be secured. There are other methods that you can support cables in the ceiling. You can do J-hooks with beam clamps, trapeze systems with all-thread and Kindorf. You can attach the J-hooks to the exterior walls. There are other methods, but sometimes the only method you have to support a cable is attaching it to a wire, your own independent wire that you install. And that's where paragraph B comes into play. Paragraph B, titled Wiring Systems Installed Above Suspended Ceilings. And it says, supported wires do not provide secure support, shall not be used or permitted as sole support. Support wires and associated fittings that provide secure support and that are installed in addition to the ceiling grid wires shall be permitted as sole support. Where independent wires are used, they shall be secured at both ends, and cables and raceways shall not be supported by ceiling grids. So let's unpack that. First, I want to zero in on that. Installed in addition to ceiling grid support wires. So you have to install your own independent support system, your own independent wire. Okay. The next thing I want to zero in on is shall be permitted as sole support. So shall be permitted as a permissive statement in the code book, which means you can do it that way. You can support other ways too, but this is one method that they do allow, but it's got to be the sole support. It can't be carrying the load of the J-hook in your cables and the grid. The sole purpose for this independent wire that you installed is to support your own cabling. The next section, they shall be secured at both ends. This is commonly done wrong by people in the field a lot, because they'll shoot that CC27 clip in the ceiling, attach their independent wire to that, attach their J-hook to that wire with a bat wing, and then cut that wire and let it swing, because they think that it has to be isolated from the ceiling grid. No, it has to be attached to the grid. And then final, it says cables and raceways shall not be supported by ceiling grids. So right there it says you can't just lay it on the grid for the very reasons I talked about earlier. You have to be able to get in the ceiling. The electrical inspector has to be able to get in the ceiling. The fire department has to be able to get into that ceiling. Now, further on in that same section, there's two other paragraphs. One's called fire-rated assemblies, and the other's called non-fire-rated assemblies. And it talks about that actual wire. Now, it doesn't matter which section you're reading it out because they're verbatim on this point. And the point says, where independent support wires are used, they shall be distinguishable by color, tagging, or other effective means. That means when you install your own independent wire, you have to somehow identify that wire as your wire. Painting is probably the simplest. You buy a bunch of the clips already with the wires attached to them. You take them outside, you lay them on a piece of plywood or something, and you spray paint them all whatever color you want. Blue, orange, fuchsia, chartreuse. You pick the color, right? And then when the inspector comes out, you can say, hey, anything with orange color is mine. Aeroco, that's a company that manufactures support systems for low voltage cabling. They make this clip that snaps on. It's yellow. It snaps onto the ceiling T-bar, and you can attach your grid wire to that. I really like that system because when you pull cable in a ceiling using J-hooks as your supports, a common best practice by the industry is to pull the cable and then lay the cable in the J-hook. You're not supposed to pull cables through J-hook. But let's be honest, we've all done that. When you pull a cable through a J-hook, what happens to that wire when the head of that cable hits that J-hook? It bends the wire and it makes the ceiling flex. If you damage that cable during new construction, the ceiling contractor is going to back charge you to fix it. If you damage the cable in an existing office, the customer is going to come after you to fix that. So you should be pulling the cable and then laying them in the J-hooks. So another statement that I hear quite often when I'm teaching classes or when I'm out in the field talking to people, but Chuck, I thought the code book said I can lay up to 3 cables on the ceiling. Well, that was a true statement a long time ago. The last time I saw that statement in a code book was in the early 2000s. Right now, the oldest code book that's in use in the United States right now is the 2008 code book. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So that verbiage was actually in the 1999 code book or the early 2000s. They took out one of those two versions. I don't remember which one. I don't have those versions of the code book to be able to tell you. And what it actually said was that you can have up to 3 cables laying on the grid in a 10 by 10 square foot area. That verbiage was fought for by the telephone company. So they can just lay their cables on the grid because they said, hey, it's just 3 4-pair cable. Well, today's 4-pair cables, especially if it's Cat 6A, Cat 6A can be up to 40 pounds per 1,000 feet. Now, to use that statement, that the verbiage that used to be in the code book, it said that those 3 cables can only accumulate a total number of 3 cables from 8 different sections in the code book. And those 8 different sections are Article 640, 650, 725, 760, 770, 800, 820, and 830. So you couldn't have 3 cables from each of those sections. It had to be 3 cables total for all. If you had more than 3 cables, then it said in a fine print note that they had to be supported in a manner consistent with 300.11. So keep that in mind. And that verbiage was taken out a long time ago. I'll tell you something else that I hear quite often. Well, Chuck, sometimes I see the electricians attach their branch circuits to the ceiling grid. How come they can do that? So again, in the code book, it says, Article 300.11, Paragraph B, Subsection 2, under non-fire rated assemblies, it says, the ceiling systems shall be permitted to support branch circuit wiring and associated equipment, listen closely, where installed in accordance with the ceiling systems manufacturer's instructions. So they can only do that if the ceiling has been tested and listed to support that additional cabling. Well, a lot of the manufacturers now don't even want you doing that anymore, so you don't come across it as much. I mentioned about how that verbiage was taken out of the code book in the late 1990s or the early 2000s. There's this thing called the NEC Adoption Map. It's put out by the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association. They revise the map the first of every month. So I went and looked at, in preparation for my show today, I went and looked at that map on 11/1/2020. Again, there was only 2 states that were the oldest code book they were operating out of is the 2008. Everybody else was a newer code book. Those 2 states were Kansas and Indiana. nobody was using those old code books anymore that had those old verbiage. So don't assume that you can just leave 3 cables laying on the grid and get away with it. You will get yourself in problems with an electrical inspector. So to sum up today's show, we talked about why you couldn't lay just cables on a grid or attach it to the grid wire. It's going to affect the performance, the safety, and it's going to make you look unprofessional. If you happen to have a picture of some cables laying on the grid, hey, email them to me. Email them to chuck@5minutercdd.com. That's going to help me do the picture. Let me know if you want credit for that picture. So remember, mentor somebody and make sure that they learn and know they can't be laying those cables on the grid. So until next time, be safe.
That's it for this episode of today's podcast. We hope you were able to learn something. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. Also, leave a rating so we can help even more people learn about telecommunications. Until next time, be safe.